Okay, I love chocolate. I think the ID for right now.
Okay, so we're getting to the time in the semester where we need to be taking care of yourself. So make sure you get your rest. Make sure you're eating that you need to. Stay hydrated. Try not to overdo it. Make sure you organize things so everything gets done and you're not panicking as you move through. So announcements. Tomorrow we're going to start ration balancing. I think you have to do some math, but we'll get into ration balancing. Extra credit opportunities. The times for the open house are 11 o'clock at the Sheila Johnson. There's a classroom there. We're supposed to meet with potential students for ag business, dairy, and ag science there. And then potentially, if there's an interest, there'll be a dairy tour at 1 o'clock. I don't know if that's going to happen. Student success seminars, don't forget those. Review session. We'll do one next Monday and the Monday after. I don't think you had this last week or Monday. I think we added this in the review session. What's going to be covered. So we're going to cover through today. And then you have 2 weeks to get all your questions out, to learn everything and get ready for the test. So that's the one that looks like a barn down there on the corner. So off of Eaton Street, it's the entrance right next to the activities center. I guess that's what it's called. And then the hockey thing, all that. It's right next to, everybody knows Sealy. So everybody knows where Sealy is, right? They buried a cow on campus. There's a big plaque out front of the ice rink out there on the hill. She was 20 years old and gave like twice as much as her peers. So she's buried on campus. There's a picture of her in the office up at the dairy. If you go in the office, turn around and look up.
Oh, with the dude?
Yeah, that dude. We still don't know who that dude is.
Right.
We took it to a farm show and it's like, do you know who this guy is? We don't know. It's not the president. So I don't know who it is. So we'll take care of it from there. So tomorrow, Hannah and Maddie. And then where would you, Molly? Your Monday. There you go. So what we had some issues on Monday. Kirsten Kelly. Yeah, they got a 41 for dry matter on the corn silage. And when I went and checked your sample, I assume you dumped it in the waste bucket. Does that sound right? The basket after you were done with it, the center of it was still wet. So we had some electrical issues up there. It's happened to me before where if something pops up there or a surge goes through, it shuts off all the timers. So you go back after 2 hours and you think everything's done, but it's not. So we still had water in there. So what does that water become in the calculation? Where have we been running? Anybody been doing corn silage? Where have we been running? 30, 32, somewhere in there. We came up with 51. That water is being counted as dry matter in the measurement, and that's not where it's supposed to be. You're supposed to get down to that plateau, and because the switches shut off, we didn't get down there, at least for the corn silage. It seems that I reran both of them. They seem to be there. Another question related to dry matters, since the gentleman that was supposed to do the 17th didn't. So Justin and Riley. So I came back Saturday night from Dairy Challenge and those buckets were still sitting there untested. So I said, well, I'll try to run them. What the hell, right? I got them down to the digester barn and they were really squishy and sloppy and all that stuff. Really, really wet. So, well, I'll run them anyway. I got, I think, a 21 and an 18. So why did that happen? What happened? Yeah, we talked about it yesterday. Talked about it in the review session. What happened? Why was it so much wetter than it normally is? What was it doing for Thursday, Friday, and Saturday? It was rotting. It was molding. So what was happening? Respiration. What's the end product of respiration? Is that mold and bacteria we're trying to grow? What's the end product? And carbon dioxide and water. So all that stuff in there was taking dry matter and turning it to water. We're shifting it from one place to another. So that's another thing I've done. Tried to save ears of corn because the squirrels rip my bird feeders apart. So try to entice them away with ears of corn. If you don't get it dry enough, it starts molding in the squirrel proof containers. And then you get rain inside because you're generating so much moisture that it accelerates the whole rotting process and you have to throw all that corn out. So once you get started, so we Kirsten graphed it. I covered it back up so you can see where I whited it out. So, well, we didn't do the 17th. We just skipped over and then the 20th because I can't go backwards. So, and I assumed that 18 and 21 were just wrong. So I wasn't even going to put them up on the chart. So, okay, everybody know what we're doing. Okay, so we left off last time. We are talking about NDF and what happens to it in the rumen. So if we start to think about our NDF, there's certain fractions or certain portions in the NDF that ferment very easily. And you could say the same thing for starch, same thing for protein, but we're going to focus on the NDF for the moment. And then there's some of it that if you leave it long enough, the microbes will get to it, but it's very, very hard for those microbes to break it down. So you have the total intake of a nutrient. In this case, we're looking at NDF. Some of it is available or not available to the animal or to the microbes. Some of it is, but you've got varying degrees of availability. So depending on how long the microbes have to work on that NDF, depending how long it stays in the rumen, you're going to have a certain proportion that is digested and a certain proportion that is undigested. Will pass to the lower tract unchanged. So depending on where we are, if I spend more time in the rumen or I have a faster rate of fermentation, more of that NDF will be digested or fermented in the rumen. If I have things that spend less time in the rumen or ferment at a slower rate, I'm going to have a smaller proportion of that NDF is disappearing in the rumen, is being used by the microbes, is being digested, fermented in the rumen. So one of the things about balancing for carbohydrates is we got to think about how long does that stuff stay in the rumen. And there are some things we've talked about already that will influence that. So people talk about, we're going to talk about rumen fermentability of NDF. If you talk to professional nutritionists, they always call it digestibility. But rumen, we can't digest NDF. We talked about that as ruminants. The microbes can digest it, but we call that fermentation. But the scientists always call it digestibility. So NDF, most of the non-NDF fractions of feed are more or less totally digested. So the digestibility of a diet is really a function of how much NDF is digested. So the more NDF we have, the less digestible the whole ration is. Less NDF we have, the more. So it's negatively correlated with total digestibility. The indigestible portion of the NDF is the acid detergent lignin associated with the hemicellulose and cellulose. The lignin kind of creeps in to the hemicellulose and cellulose and blocks fermentation by rumen microbes. I've got all this, you can't touch it. So we call that bound, tied up, or blocked from digestion by the microbes. Digestibility of the NDF, fermentability depends on the composition. How much lignin do I have? How much cellulose do I have? Is it easily digestible, not digestible? The longer it spends in the rumen, the more digestible it is. The conditions of the rumen, if we have a balanced rumen at neutral or close to neutral pH, more is going to be digested than if we're bouncing up and down because of acidosis. So more balanced is going to lead to more digestibility. And then our ruminal population of microbes, which ones of those microbes can actually tear apart NDF and make it available as VFA to our cow. So we talk about fiber digesters. We talk about the ones that are going to handle that NDF. So the more of those we have, and they tend to be the most finicky and the most sensitive of all the microbes in the rumen. So we need a good balanced rumen to keep everything going there. So there are programs now, our ration balancing programs are going to predict how much carbohydrate is digested by the cow and therefore calculate what the energy of that diet is. So they're figuring out digestible energy, digestible carbohydrate, what's available to the cow. The new NRC talked about every feed in a specific cow in a specific rumen is unique. So I think this was a way of saying, well, it depends on the circumstances as to how much carbohydrate is digested across the whole tract. There's an average, but there's a wide range, or can be. Generally, we have things that are based on in single point in vitro fermentation. You put some feed in a flask, throw some rumen fluid in there, and you measure the amount of disappearance over a certain time frame. You can't restart that. Well, this is how much we got. Let's keep going. You can only go to a certain time frame, and that's all you can. The prediction is based on rates and pools. How many pounds, my pool size, and then what rate or percentage per hour disappears in the rumen. And then the program tries to predict how long the starch, how long the NDF will stay in the rumen based on the diet and dry matter intake. So it gets pretty complicated at the end. We need to think about the ball, the mass of feed in the rumen, that NDF. We need it there physically to do some things that are going to balance that rumen out. So if we've got that big ball of particle size, it's going to increase retention. You can imagine how hard it is to filter small particles through that big ball. So the bigger, the more stable that ball is, the more it's going to hold the little particles back, the byproduct NDF, and allow that to be fermented. You're going to have, with more and a stable mass of NDF in the rumen, you're going to have increased buffering. It just does buffering associated with its presence. The chemical nature of the cell wall, you're going to have increased ruminal wall stimulation. Increased mixing is going to move more stimulation in the rumen wall, is going to move the VFAs out. You're going to get always fresh VFAs at the wall. They're going to be absorbed. If you're not mixing, you got a big concentration of VFAs in the center. Everything that can be absorbed on the outside's already been absorbed. That continuous mixing is also going to promote passage. So the mixing is going to promote absorption, get that VFA out of the rumen. It's also going to promote passage of VFAs to the lower tract, the omasum, the abomasum. Hopefully it gets everything gets absorbed in the omasum. That stimulation of the rumen wall is going to lead to increased chewing. We think specifically of rumination. So with rumination, we get increased buffer flow, saliva flow to the rumen, and then that gets mixed in, keeps things on a more even keel. We have increased particle breakdown as those chews work on that feed. They're moving it back and forth across their teeth. They're crushing it. They're opening it. It's opposed to chopping it. That mass or ball allows the cow to maintain energy or VFA flow to the liver when she's not eating. This is one of the advantages of having a high fill diet when you're feeding your dry cows. Does everybody know what the eating pattern associated with dry cows is? Right around calving, what happens? Do cows eat when they're calving? Nope. So for that 24 hours or so, they stop eating. But they have enough stuff in their rumen that they're continually getting protein produced. They're continually getting VFA produced. That's the advantage of a high-fill dry cow diet, is they continue to get nutrition when they stop eating. You have continual fill, right? So stuff gets digested, you bring new stuff in. Stuff gets digested, bring new stuff in. When she goes to calving, you got this full rumen. She stops eating. As it ferments and digests, you're going to get a whole lot less of it, but it's still going to provide nutrition to her as those microbes continue to work over that 24-hour period. Now, the danger of all this is, what do you fill her with right after she's done calving? You have to be careful as to what that ration is that fills her back up. You got a big empty rumen in there. You got a calf that's left the building. You've got lots of room to fill up. And that's why some places will pump her, right? To fill up, to hold that abomasum down in place so it can't flip up and cause problems. So we're thinking about that ball, that mass, that mat of fiber in the rumen, the NDF, best described as the physically effective NDF or the forage NDF. So we're thinking about indigestible NDF. This stuff cannot be digested by the cows or the microbes. This is all the stuff potentially PD, potentially digestible NDF. Depending on how long that stays, we're going to have a certain portion that's undigested and a certain portion that is digested. Digestible NDF versus undigestible NDF. The longer it stays in the rumen, the more we move potentially digestible into the digested pool. The shorter it is, we leave that potentially digestible NDF untouched, and it falls into that undigested fraction. So depending on how well our rumens are working, we're going to move up and down on that split. So the same thing that we've kind of done before, this is with the forage NDF. We're looking for somewhere forage NDF concentration somewhere around 22% of the diet. we can cheat down or cheat up depending on what we have. So higher dry matter intakes, we can cheat down a little bit on our ration NDF concentration. Why is that? Anybody figure that one out? It's all about the pounds. If I get enough pounds in there, and I can do that with a lower concentration but a higher dry matter intake, as long as I get the pounds in there, I'm okay. So faster ruminal clearance, faster digestible, finely chopped particles, higher starch in the diet, lower non-fiber. Non-forage fiber sources, non-forage fiber sources. So byproducts. So this means byproducts usually. We have to cheat up all things that are going to make that ball not form as well. Anything that stabilizes the rumen, we can cheat down. All of these things tend to destabilize the rumen, so we need to cheat up to get a measure of NDF protection. Make sure we maintain that rumen doing what it should. So this brings us into forage quality. We talked about forage quality from a sensory evaluation. What does it smell like? What does it look like? What does it feel like? But a lot of people, when they talk about forage quality, they mean NDF quality or the digestibility of that NDF. So again, using the same phrases and having different meanings. So the more digestible the NDF, the higher the quality of the forage. So it's associated with low lignin and younger or less mature plants. So as a plant grows up, it puts down more and more lignin. It also loses some of the other parts, and what's left behind, that stem, has a lot of lignin in it. So we can also think about BMR versus conventional corn hybrids. We have the same thing now with alfalfa. We have low lignin alfalfa. We have low lignin corn, the BMR corn. We have a mutation in there where it doesn't form, it doesn't take all the building blocks it creates and turn it into fully formed final lignin. Those precursors, those building blocks build up in the rib on the leaf and turn it brown. That's why it's called brown midrib. So alfalfas versus grass. Grass tend to be lower lignin as a rule. Alfalfa tends to be higher lignin. So we've got a greater undigestible pool of NDF in alfalfa, but what is potentially digestible digests faster, so it clears out of the rumen faster. Grass tends to back up, so brown midrib on the leaf, telltale sign that you're going to have some issues about standability and possibly yield if we don't have enough lignin there. So brown midrib corns versus traditional silage, you're going to get higher dry matter intake if physical fill is limiting. You're going to get higher milk yield. It costs more per bag, and you're going to get a lower yield from those fields. There's a yield drag. Some places it's not too much different. Other places it's quite significant that we get less BMR tons per acre than conventional corn, which is one of the reasons we've switched back to conventional corn, at least for some of our silage. Any questions on feed quality? So forage quality, NDF digestibility, higher digestibility of NDF, higher forage quality, lower digestibility, lower forage quality. This kind of leads into a discussion of feed efficiency. You'll hear the pigs and the sheep and the beef talk about feed efficiency. How do they turn the feed that we feed them into a final product? How well do they do that? The thing with most of those is you're kind of like a terminal product. With our cows, we're going through a life cycle. So we're going through various stages where they're giving toward their calf or they're getting ready for the next calf, and feed efficiency changes. So feed efficiency equals the pounds of milk produced over the pounds of dry matter consumed. And we're looking at, more often than not, somewhere in the 1.5 range. 1.5 pounds average for all the feed we consume. So you can always back calculate. If you figure out how much the herd is producing, you can probably back calculate more or less what their dry matter intake is. So when it's not a bad formula, it's about right usually. You can also go through and say, well, not all milk is the same. Some milk has more energy in it. We take a Jersey versus a Holstein. Peak lactation versus late lactation. There's more energy in a Jersey's milk. There's more energy or fat in a late lactation animal's milk. So sometimes we'll correct it, solids corrected or fat corrected milk pounds. Not everybody does that. Energy corrected milk. But again, it's milk over dry matter intake. So the efficiency depends on the digestibility of the feed, how digestible, how much energy can be extracted from a pound of feed, and then what the animal is doing. Is she gaining weight or losing weight? Early lactation, she's losing weight. What's happening with the weight she's losing? Anybody know? Early lactation, where that fat and protein coming off her body condition or coming off her back ends up? Early lactation. Gonna end up in the milk pail, right? So, whereas late lactation, she's gaining weight, she's taking some of the energy and nutrients that she's got, and she's putting protein and fat on her back. That's going to influence her feed efficiency. If we look at mid-lactation cows, overall, we're looking at 1.4 to 1.5 is fairly standard for feed efficiency. Early lactation, we've got 1.8 pounds of milk for every pound consumed of dry matter or higher, depending on the farm we're on. So in early lactation, where's the energy from milk coming from? Where's the protein for milk coming from in early lactation? Anybody want to guess? Feed and what did we just say what she's doing in early lactation? Taking it from her body. So the body and the feed are providing the building blocks for milk. This is why early lactation is more efficient. Because feed efficiency, and that's the problem with using feed efficiency with lactating cows, doesn't account for what she's contributing off her body. We're just comparing what goes in to what comes out, not what went in, stayed there for 6 months, and now is coming out. Conversely, our late lactations are going to be lower in feed efficiency because they're doing what? They're taking some of that feed energy and doing what? Feed protein and doing what? Putting it on their back. So they're taking some of that milk production or the feed, instead of putting it in milk production, we're splitting it up. A portion goes to her back, body condition, and a portion goes to feed a calf. So efficiency drops down because you're not using all of your feed energy to create milk anymore. You're using it to create milk and body condition. So that's going to go down. So, and again, these are rough numbers. And again, because a cow changes from gaining weight to losing weight, their efficiencies are going to go down depending on the proportion of mid lactation animals in a group, late lactation animals in a group, early lactation animals in a group, or even growing animals in a group. You're going to play with your efficiencies and stuff. Every few years, somebody goes, well, we need to be really managing feed efficiency with our lactating cows. It's hard to do. You got to make sure you account for animals that are taking stuff off their back, animals that are putting stuff on their back, making sure we account for or allow for all the physiological processes. It's not like a beef cow where you know how much you fed them, you know how much is a hanging weight, and you can do that math pretty easy. We're not doing growing and gaining weight and losing weight. That beef cow continues to gain weight. You know how much you fed that animal, and you can make that feed efficiency number pretty definitively. But in a group of cattle that are all in different stages, that number becomes very fuzzy. But every few years, somebody goes, well, we got to manage that. It's like, no, there's a lot of noise in those numbers. Any questions on carbohydrates? Energy, any questions? Next up is fats. What do we know about fats as a nutrient group? Anything? Anybody know anything about fat?
There's two kinds.
Two kinds. What kinds are there? Any extras out there, handouts? So what do we know about fats? Okay, hopefully we'll learn something. So fats are generally made up of only carbon and hydrogen atoms. They're hydrocarbons mostly. There's an occasional oxygen in there, doing some linkage and things like that, but mostly we're looking at carbons and hydrogens. This is going to make those fats generally insoluble in water. So fats are defined by their solubility in liquid. So they're water insoluble. A synonym for that will be hydrophobic. They are ether soluble. That's why fat is sometimes called ether extract. We put a speed sample in an ether extraction setup, and we measure the feed, the portion of the feed that disappears. That is called ether extract or crude fat. So all of these are kind of synonyms: water insoluble, hydrophobic, ether soluble, ether extract are all ways we can think about the fats that are in our feed. So what is fat used for? One of the primary functions of fat is to use it for energy. And as we mentioned before, fat has 2.25 times the energy of a carbohydrate. And that's because we've gotten rid of most of the oxygen and we're down to just carbons and hydrogens. If we're thinking about energy, the storage form is called a triglyceride. We're going to store that fat for later. You're going to make a molecule called the triglyceride, which has a glycerol molecule and 3 fatty acids of a variety of lengths and saturation attached to them. So all that fat in my body here is all in the form of triglycerides. So our fatty acids can be saturated with no double bonds in them, for those of you who had chemistry. Those are usually of an animal origin. Our animals tend to be saturated fat. Our unsaturated fats tend to come from plant or fish origin. That helps keep things fluid at colder temperatures. Most of our mammals are homeothermic. They have a set body thing. If you've got fish or plants, they're dealing with living in temperatures that are something less than our body temperature. And that unsaturatedness helps keep things fluid at colder temperatures. The classic example of this is, anybody here like bacon? So what happens when you cook bacon? That's my job every Sunday, to cook the bacon. Fat comes out. So what do you, when you finish your bacon, what does that fat look like? It's hot and liquid. If you let it sit long enough on the stove there, it's going to solidify. Bacon's got a range of saturated and unsaturated. How many people here like butter? So where do you keep butter? Some people keep it in the fridge. It's not necessary. Keep it in the cupboard. Keep it on the counter in a butter dish. Why do we do that? So it's a little softer and doesn't rip apart our toast, right? So depending on the temperature, the amount of saturated versus unsaturated will make things liquid or solid. Butter from our cows tends to be saturated, so it's solid at room temperature. Anybody here do popcorn the old-fashioned way with boiling it in oil? What is the oil, corn oil, vegetable oil, all that stuff? What does that look like in your kitchen? It's liquid. So vegetable, plant origin, it tends to be unsaturated. In your kitchen, it's liquid form, or more unsaturated. And there are good reasons for that. Tends to be more flexible. Fats are used for structures and signals. Cholesterol, essential molecule in the body, gets a huge bad rap for things, but necessary to make all of our hormones. It's a building block for that. Fats also make up prostaglandins. We need those for there. So those 3 are usually signal. Well, hormones and prostaglandins are signals. Cholesterol is a precursor to hormones, or it's part of our lipid membranes. Everybody's heard of the lipid bilayer that makes up the cell membranes. Basically, our cell membranes are fat, a layer of fat that surrounds the cell. So those phospholipids, the phospholipid bilayer, is that another one maybe you've heard? Those fats are the membrane on the outside of the cell. Those structural components or signals that the body has that are made up building blocks or functions of fat molecules. We've got some essential fatty acids that are going to go for those various functions. They'll have different signals in the body. Oleic, linoleic, linolenic. Fats are also, if you extract that ether extract, they're also going to draw in vitamins. So we have fat soluble vitamins that are also going to be associated with the fat. They'll be stored in the liver, they'll be stored in your fat. So losing weight rapidly usually releases a lot of those vitamins, depending on how much you got stored there. It could be toxic on some level. So we're thinking about a cow's normal diet. They're dealing with whole plants. Generally, whole plants are 3% fat. You think about the lawn out there, probably 3% fat on a dry matter basis. Except things that we're dealing with might be producing oil seeds like soybeans as they get more and more mature, or corn, the corn oil associated with the seed or development of the cob. We're going to have a little bit higher for our plants. So we're thinking about a cow and its normal diet. Cow's going to want or need a low-fat diet. That's what they're good at, right? Whereas pigs, us, we're pretty good at handling higher fat diets. Cows can't handle a high fat diet. That's why we get things like fatty liver and ketosis and all those things. So if you're looking at sources, we got the whole plant. We may be feeding our animals oil seeds. Soybeans, cottonseed are probably the most popular for whole oil seeds. As we move forward, byproducts can be pretty high or contribute significantly to the fat in a cow's diet. So if we're dealing with grains where we remove the starch, the remaining is enriched or higher in oil. So distillers' grains, brewers' grains are going to have a lot more fat in them than the original grains we started with. Barley, the corn that we started with. We also can provide fat in the form of tallow. So rendering industry, instead of throwing things into a landfill, they try to sell anything they can. So sometimes we can take some of the trimmed fat and feed it back to our cows. The last source we'll talk about is manufactured. Where is our example in this class of manufactured fat? What smelled manufactured in our feed ID exam? So the calcium salts of palm oil, the burger fat, I think is the name of it up there. You've got energy booster, you've got Megalac, you've got all those different manufactured fats that will feed to an animal. So that's probably a good place to stop today. I have a quiz for you before you leave. Well, so when you're done, you're free to go.